I mean, there's this huge divide that especially among, let's call it the American working class, whatever that is, because we know that it's multiracial. We know that there's a lot of complexity in the working class in the United States politically, economically. But there is this use of China, this exploiting of this anti-China propaganda as a means to divide working people across the board. And it places blame onto China, right, as this communist boogie, this new, like, quote unquote authoritarian dictatorship that, I mean, has been around for a while and was a really a target of the United States ever since the Chinese Revolution. But now, right, now that China is in this very interesting position that I don't think the United States is really prepared for in this technological kind of advanced stage. I mean, when you were talking, Carl, about paying with WeChat and Alipay, I had cab drivers looking at me. I was there at the end of 2019, early 2020. Cab drivers were like looking at me weird. Like, they're just like, why are you trying to give me this RMB in paper form? Like, they kept on being like, oh, you don't speak Chinese, so I'm just gonna point to my phone until you get it that you're supposed to pay this way, you know. But that's how I felt too. It's just like, wow, this is not even what I expected. I thought I was going to see a lot more of the underdevelopment, a lot more of the quote unquote contradictions that especially even the left likes to talk about, right? Like China is, even if it's advancing at the expense of people. But I just saw a lot of just overall benefit for people in terms of transit, high speed rail, in terms of how people were able to, for example, get very heavy subsidies on things like electric cars and renewable energy. I mean, it was really interesting, and people were very confident too. And they would ask me, "Hey, are you scared about being in the United States right now? Because people are just getting shot up there." And I'm just like, yeah. It's like, it's a thing. It's definitely a thing. But Xiang Yu, I know you wanted to jump in here.
So, Carl talked about how there is this sort of perception that Asian people or Chinese people in general, or Chinese people or Asian people in general, are not creative and cannot innovate. And part of that kind of misconception comes from the fact that for the longest time, economically, China was kind of was a factory for the world because when it was still building up its economy. So of course, education wise and stuff, people were more focused on the skills that were required to get that stuff done, to get like manufacturing and that sort of stuff done for foreign companies. But then after it reached a certain economic point, to the point where it can actually start innovating, that's that's when there was this sort of cognitive dissonance when they realize, oh, Chinese people are not just innately robots or not innovative. It's because there were different priorities in the economy at different points in time. And now that it's at the stage where innovation is a priority and they're doing a pretty good job at it, that's when people are starting to feel threatened.
Yeah, Amanda, do you want to jump in?
Maybe I'll jump in and sort of like talk a little bit more about the geopolitical context and
Please.
the link to this rise of anti-Asian assaults. Danny, you mentioned a little bit earlier in the show about this new study that came out talking about the rise in anti-Asian violence and how it's really escalated. So I've read a couple of articles about that study, and I think what's really remarkable about that study is that the CEO of the nonprofit that published this study, the Leading Asian Americans United for Change, he actually said that he actually implicated media representations of China and anti-China news stories as largely a reason for this spike in anti-Asian violence that we're seeing. And he said, politicians need to be very careful with all this bashing of China because it directly influences how people view and treat Asian Americans in the US. And I think I think it's really remarkable because this is really the first time in like something mainstream that we have seen someone say that this China bashing directly is a reason for the rise in these anti-Asian hate crimes that we're seeing. And, I think that's, good news that this someone in the mainstream is finally admitting it, right? Because for the past 2 years, what I've seen for the most part is a lot of people arguing that there's no evidence that this anti-China media coverage is what's causing all of these hate crimes. And a lot of people were seemingly wanting to like see a direct link, that, like a Washington Post article bashing China was the reason for Christina Unili's death. Her murderer read a Washington Post article that was anti-China, and that's what led him to sexually assault her and kill her. And, as we know, the link is not that direct. What this kind of anti-China new Cold War coverage does is it contributes to an existing atmosphere where Chinese and Asian people have historically been dehumanized, and that's what makes them more vulnerable to attacks. So I just wanted to point that out because, insofar as like people were, bringing up China, they were just saying that this spike in anti-Asian violence was due to Trump referring to COVID as the China virus. But as we all know, that's a really ahistorical view of anti-Asian racism, because, Chinese people have been vilified in the like Western imagination, since Chinese people have immigrated here to like pan for gold, like back in the 19th century, right? Yeah, and I'll leave it at that. So
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump didn't make that up out of his head. I mean, that's just, I mean, all the liberals would say, "Oh, Trump is so stupid," but yet the whole framing of like Trump being this individual that created, that kind of like sparked this wave of anti-Asian racism gives him not just a whole lot of power, but also I feel like a whole lot of credit for something that has such a long history and really does, as you said, Amanda, it does connect to this new Cold War propaganda, which has policy to it, right? It's not just ideas, right? It's
I
an old Marxist dictum that it's not just ideas just don't come out of nowhere. But Carl, yeah, I'll let you jump in.
I think Trump is popular in some circles because he says the quiet things loud, right? I mean, like it's not like the what he says are just Trump takes credit for making up of all the things he said. These kind of memes have always existed, but for a long time they're being suppressed. People understood it's not something to talk about in polite conversation. But racism has always existed in U.S. and what Trump is doing is just amplifying the existing racism that's already there. And what Amanda said earlier about mainstream media finally admitting to the link between the xenophobia they whip up in mainstream media versus the anti-Asian crime on the street is that it's hard to cover up anymore. It's so in your face, right? I mean, like anytime they report a COVID outbreak in Chicago or New York, they put a picture of a street view of Tokyo, of Hong Kong, of all these East Asian people wearing masks. It has nothing to do with the article itself, but visually it links again, Asian people to COVID. They've done it again and again and again. I mean, this is not a coincidence anymore. So I think I'm glad that's been called out, but it's really hard to deny that anymore. I mean, this is what they, what Trump created is the atmosphere where all these people felt it's safe to do so. It's safe to come out and say all the racist things and to do this right in the open.